The year was 1589, and behind the gilded doors of the Louvre Palace, a secret so scandalous unfolded that it would shake the very foundations of the French monarchy. In a dimly lit chamber, away from the prying eyes of courtiers and spies, the most powerful man in France stood before an ornate mirror, but the reflection staring back was not that of a king. Draped in shimmering silk, adorned with pearls that caught the flickering candlelight, and crowned with an elaborate blonde wig, Henry III had vanished entirely. In his place stood a woman of breathtaking elegance, one whose very existence would ultimately cost him his life. This wasn't mere royal eccentricity or a moment of theatrical whimsy. This was the carefully guarded truth of one of Europe's most enigmatic rulers. A monarch who dared to live as both king and queen in an age when such defiance could mean death. For decades, Henry III maintained a double life so extraordinary that even today, historians struggle to fully comprehend its implications. By day, he commanded armies, negotiated with foreign powers, and ruled over a fractured nation torn apart by religious warfare. By night, he transformed into someone else entirely, embracing an identity that brought him the only peace he would ever know. But how did the last king of the Valois dynasty come to live such a dangerous existence? What drove a man born to absolute power to risk everything for moments of forbidden authenticity? And why did his enemies ultimately use this secret to orchestrate one of the most shocking assassinations in European history? The story begins not with royal pageantry, but with a child who simply refused to conform. Born Alexandre-Édouard de France on September 19, 1551, the future Henry III entered the world as the fourth son of King Henry II and the formidable Catherine de' Medici. From his earliest days, this prince was unlike any who had come before him. While his brothers gravitated toward the brutal sports of warfare and hunting that defined masculine nobility, young Alexandre found himself drawn to an entirely different world. He preferred the refined company of court ladies to the rough camaraderie of soldiers. He was fascinated by their elaborate gowns, their glittering jewelry, their cultured discussions of poetry and art. Most tellingly of all, he showed absolutely no interest in the violent pastimes that were supposed to shape him into a proper prince. Fencing disgusted him as barbaric. Hunting struck him as needlessly cruel. Instead, he would rather spend hours discussing Italian sonnets or watching the palace seamstresses at their intricate work. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, was among the first to notice these unusual inclinations. A woman whose political instincts were as sharp as any blade, she initially attempted to correct what she saw as problematic behavior. Stricter tutors were brought in. Harsher discipline was applied. But Catherine was too intelligent a strategist to persist with failed tactics for long. She soon realized that trying to force her son into a conventional mold would only drive his true nature deeper underground. And underground secrets had a way of becoming political weapons in the hands of one's enemies. The incident that would define Alexandre's childhood occurred when he was just 9 years old. During an important religious festival, the young prince mysteriously vanished from the royal apartments, throwing the entire court into panic. Guards searched frantically through every corridor and chamber of the palace. Hours passed with no sign of the missing heir. Finally, he was discovered in the private quarters of one of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, wearing her most elegant gown and happily acting out the role of a princess trapped in an enchanted tower. When confronted by his father, the stern King Henry II, Alexandre showed not a trace of shame or embarrassment. With the innocent honesty that only children possess, he explained that he had simply wanted to know what it felt like to be as beautiful as the court ladies. The king's reaction was immediate and furious. In his world, strength and masculinity weren't just expectations, but absolute requirements for survival. The thought that his son might possess what he saw as feminine weaknesses horrified him beyond measure. Punishment followed swiftly, along with even more demanding tutors assigned to beat these dangerous tendencies out of the boy. But repression, as Catherine wisely understood, only teaches concealment, not correction. Young Alexandra quickly learned the essential skill that would define his entire life: how to present an acceptable public face while keeping his authentic self carefully hidden from hostile eyes. Catherine, ever the master politician, adjusted her strategy with characteristic cunning. Rather than continue a futile war against her son's nature, she chose to manage it strategically. She discreetly allowed Alexandra limited, carefully supervised access to the women's quarters of the palace, but only under the condition of absolute secrecy. This wasn't maternal indulgence, but political calculation. A child with unconventional traits could become a powerful asset if properly managed, but a liability if allowed to develop without guidance. Under this new arrangement, Alexandra began his true education in earnest. Alongside the traditional princely studies of Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian, he developed an exquisite appreciation for visual arts, music, and dance. His tutors included not only seasoned diplomats and military strategists, but also expert tailors, perfumers, and specialists in courtly etiquette. Officially, these lessons were justified as essential training for understanding every aspect of French court life. In reality, they were luring in the shadows. The death touring the private world that Alexandra was construct of King Henry II in 1563 changed everything for the young prince. A jousting accident left the king mortally wounded, and after days of agony, he passed away, leaving the throne to Alexandra's older brother Francis II. But Francis ruled for barely a year before dying under circumstances that many whispered involved poison. His younger brother Charles IX, still just a child, became king next, with Catherine de' Medici stepping in as regent to rule the fractured nation with iron resolve. Suddenly, Alexandra found himself third in line to the throne of France, far closer to absolute power than anyone had ever expected. As he watched his mother skillfully navigate the treacherous waters of 16th century politics, he absorbed crucial lessons about the importance of public image and theatrical presentation. It was during this period that Alexandra fully committed to what we would now recognize as gender expression through elaborate transformation. In the protected environment of the royal palace, with the assistance of a few carefully chosen and utterly loyal servants, he refined his secret feminine persona into something approaching high art. This wasn't childhood play or casual experimentation. Every detail mattered profoundly, from the expert application of cosmetics and the careful styling of elaborate wigs to the graceful posture, delicate gestures, and softened voice that completed the illusion. Years later, historians would discover fragments of a private diary that offered extraordinary young man who had found not just pleasure, but profound peace, glimpses into these intimate moments. The entries revealed in these transformations, describing hours spent as his female alter ego, with a joy and contentment that appeared nowhere else in his writings. These secret sessions became far more than mere escape from royal obligations. They represented Alexandra's only refuge from the crushing weight of expectations that threatened to suffocate his authentic self. In those precious hours when he could shed the armor of masculinity and embrace the flowing silks of femininity, he discovered something that would elude him throughout his public life: genuine happiness. The transformation was remarkable in its completeness. Contemporary accounts from trusted servants describe encounters with a mysterious court lady of extraordinary beauty wandering the palace corridors at dawn, only to later realize they had been speaking with their prince. The illusion was so perfect that even those who knew the truth found themselves momentarily convinced they were in the presence of an actual noblewoman. But Alexandra's unconventional nature would soon be tested in the most brutal arena imaginable: the battlefield. In 1569, at just 18 years old, he received an appointment that shocked the French court. His brother, King Charles IX, named him Supreme Commander of the Royal Army. Critics whispered that this delicate prince, known for his love of poetry and refinement, would crumble under the harsh realities of warfare. They could not have been more wrong. The Battle of Jarnac proved to be Alexandra's moment of triumph. Leading the Catholic forces against Protestant rebels, he demonstrated tactical brilliance that stunned even veteran commanders. His strategies were innovative, his leadership inspiring, and his results devastating for the enemy. The same intuitive understanding of human nature that served him in his feminine transformations proved equally valuable in anticipating enemy movements and motivating his troops. At Moncontour, his military reputation was cemented permanently. The Protestant forces, confident they faced an effeminate weakling, found themselves outmaneuvered by a commander whose unconventional mind produced unconventional solutions. Alexandra's victories weren't just tactical successes, they were complete vindications of his worth as a leader. Yet even amid the blood and chaos of medieval warfare, Alexandra maintained his private rituals. His officers learned to expect their commander's mysterious disappearances into his personal tent for hours after each battle. When he emerged, carrying the subtle fragrance of exotic perfumes and displaying an inexplicable serenity, no questions were asked. His men had learned that victory excused eccentricity. The year 1573 brought an opportunity that would change Alexandra's life forever. Through a masterful campaign of diplomacy, bribery, and strategic marriage promises orchestrated by Catherine de' Medici, Alexandra was elected King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. For the first time in his life, he would rule beyond the judgmental gaze of the French court. As Henry of Poland, he wasted no time in reshaping his new kingdom according to his own vision. The royal court in Krakow became a dazzling spectacle of luxury and refinement, unlike anything Poland had witnessed. Henry brought with him a carefully selected entourage of exceptionally beautiful young French noblemen, whom the Polish aristocracy mockingly dubbed les mignons, the darlings. These young men were far more than mere companions. Chosen for their loyalty, their refined beauty, and their discretion, they became Henry's confidants, advisors, and partners in elaborate private ceremonies. Behind the palace walls, away from public scrutiny, the king and his favorites engaged in transformations that went far beyond simple cross-dressing. These were theatrical productions of extraordinary sophistication. The rituals were elaborate affairs requiring hours of preparation. Henry and his mignons would assist each other in applying cosmetics with professional precision, styling elaborate wigs, and donning gowns that surpassed in luxury anything worn by actual noblewomen. The attention to detail was obsessive. Artificial breasts crafted by master artisans, jewelry selected to complement each outfit perfectly, and movements practiced until they achieved feminine grace. A secret report from the Venetian ambassador provides a glimpse into these hidden ceremonies. Writing in carefully coded language, he describes witnessing transformations so complete that he initially failed to recognize the king. The ambassador's account speaks of arts too scandalous to describe, and notes that Henry emerged from these sessions appearing as a woman of such extraordinary beauty that any man would be deceived. But this Polish paradise could not last. In May of 1574, devastating news arrived from France. King Charles IX had died suddenly, leaving no male heir. By blood and birthright, Henry was next in line for the throne of France. The time had come to abandon his sanctuary and return to a far more dangerous stage. Henry's journey back to France was orchestrated as a royal progress of unprecedented magnificence. In Venice, he spent 3 entire days acquiring rare silks, intricate jewelry, and the finest perfumes available in Europe. Officially, these purchases were described as gifts for his future queen. Documents discovered centuries later reveal the truth. Most of these luxurious items were intended for his own use, for the continuation of his secret feminine identity, even under the harsh scrutiny of the French court. The coronation of Henry III at Reims Cathedral in 1575 was a solemn and magnificent affair. But for Henry, it also marked the end of his freedom. Back in France, the political climate was far more hostile than Poland had ever been. Religious wars raged across the kingdom. Political factions plotted constantly against royal authority. Every action, every word, every gesture would be scrutinized for signs of weakness or deviation from acceptable norms. Still, as king, Henry was determined to rule according to his own vision. He transformed the Louvre into a center of unprecedented cultural refinement. The arts flourished under his patronage. Fashion evolved in directions that scandalized traditionalists, but delighted progressives. Music, poetry, and dance reached new heights of sophistication. But with cultural advancement came increased suspicion. His mignons, now established in Paris, became subjects of intense gossip and speculation. Whispers about the king's private life grew louder and more dangerous. His secret feminine transformations, now requiring even greater precautions, continued in the hidden chambers of the palace, but the risks multiplied daily. The marriage of Henry to Louise of Lorraine-Vaudémont in 1575 appeared to many observers as nothing more than a political necessity. Queens were expected to provide heirs and legitimacy, not genuine companionship. But against all expectations, a profound bond developed between the royal couple that would prove to be one of the most remarkable relationships in royal history. Louise was far from the passive, decorative queen that courtiers expected. Intelligent, perceptive, and surprisingly open-minded, she quickly grasped the complexity of her husband's nature. Rather than recoiling in horror or demanding conformity, she displayed a curiosity that bordered on fascination. The queen, who might have been expected to suppress Henry's unconventional tendencies instead, became his most trusted ally in maintaining them. Henry's involvement in designing Louise's wedding dress shocked even the most experienced royal tailors with his sophisticated understanding of women's fashion. He spent countless hours personally arranging her hair on their wedding morning, creating an elaborate masterpiece of curls and precious pearls that would influence courtly style for years to come. But more remarkable still were the discoveries made by historians centuries later in long-sealed palace archives. Private correspondence revealed that Louise not only tolerated her husband's secret transformations, but actively participated in them. She lent him her most exquisite gowns and jewelry for his feminine persona. On rare occasions, she joined the king and his mignons in their elaborate preparation rituals, helping with cosmetics, adjusting corsets, and even suggesting improvements to their theatrical presentations. This strange, quiet intimacy created a bond between the royal couple that transcended the typical political marriages of their era. But even the devoted support of a loving wife could not shield Henry from the gathering storm clouds of political opposition. His enemies, both Protestant extremists seeking to overthrow Catholic rule and hardline Catholics who viewed him as insufficiently devout, seized upon every rumor about his private life with vicious enthusiasm. Scandalous pamphlets began circulating throughout Paris, featuring crude illustrations that portrayed the king as effeminate, corrupt, and fundamentally unfit to rule. The propaganda war against Henry was particularly brutal because it struck at the very heart of 16th century concepts of legitimate authority. Royal power was inextricably linked to masculine strength, military prowess, and sexual virility. Any suggestion that a monarch possessed feminine qualities or engaged in activities deemed unmanly could be weaponized to undermine his political legitimacy. The king's flamboyant dress, his androgynous companions, his mysterious nocturnal disappearances, and his obvious discomfort with traditional enemies. The most dangerous of these enemies was the Catholic League masculine pursuits all provided ammunition for his, a powerful faction led by the ambitious Guise family. With military backing from Spain and the fanatical support of ultra-Catholic zealots, the League represented an existential threat to Henry's reign. They portrayed themselves as the true defenders of Catholic orthodoxy against a king they characterized as morally corrupt and spiritually compromised. Their propaganda machine worked tirelessly to spread the message that France deserved a ruler who embodied proper masculine virtues rather than the suspected perversions of the current monarch. The crisis reached its breaking point on May 12, 1588, a date that would forever be remembered as the Day of the Barricades. Paris erupted in violent rebellion as League supporters, armed with Spanish weapons and inflamed by months of anti-royal propaganda, seized control of the capital's streets. Barricades appeared overnight, blocking key thoroughfares and isolating royal strongholds. The city that Henry had transformed into a centre of cultural refinement became a war zone where his very presence meant death. Faced with overwhelming opposition and the collapse of royal authority in his own capital, Henry was forced into a humiliating retreat. He fled Paris under cover of darkness, abandoning the Louvre Palace where he had found his only moments of authentic happiness. The king, who had once commanded victorious armies, now found himself a refugee from his own subjects, seeking shelter in the provincial town of Blois, while his enemies celebrated their triumph in the streets of Paris. The exile from Paris proved devastating for Henry on multiple levels. Cut off from his mignons, separated from his elaborate wardrobe and cosmetics, and denied access to the private chambers where he had maintained his feminine identity, the king sank into a profound depression. Contemporary accounts describe a dramatic physical and psychological decline. The once vibrant monarch became pale, withdrawn, and visibly aged. Courtiers noted that he appeared to shrink into himself, as if some essential part of his being had been amputated. For the first time since childhood, Henry was completely unable to access the transformative rituals that had sustained him through decades of political pressure. The silk gowns, the precious jewels, the carefully applied cosmetics, the hours spent as his beloved feminine alter ego, all of it was lost, locked away in a palace now controlled by his enemies. The psychological toll was immediate and severe. Without these moments of authentic self-expression, Henry became a hollow version of himself, mechanically performing the duties of kingship while his spirit withered. But Henry was far from finished. In an act that combined his flair for the theatrical with his capacity for ruthless political calculation, he devised a plan that would shock all of Europe. On December 23, 1588, he invited his greatest enemy, Henry of Guise, to a private audience at the royal apartments in Blois. The Duke of Guise, leader of the Catholic League and architect of Henry's humiliation in Paris, arrived expecting diplomatic negotiations, or perhaps the king's surrender. Instead, he walked into an expertly orchestrated assassination. As Guise entered the royal chamber, he was ambushed by the king's personal guards and stabbed repeatedly until he died in a pool of his own blood. The following morning, Guise's brother, Cardinal Louis of Guise, was executed as well. In 2 days, Henry had eliminated the leadership of the Catholic League through calculated murder that demonstrated his enemies had severely underestimated his capacity for violence. The assassinations were intended to restore royal authority through a display of decisive strength, but they achieved exactly the opposite effect. Rather than intimidating his opponents into submission, the murders transformed Henry into an even more hated figure among devout Catholics. The League's propaganda machine now portrayed him not merely as effeminate and morally corrupt, but as a regicidal tyrant who murdered princes of the church. His political isolation deepened catastrophically as former supporters abandoned him and neutral parties chose sides against him. The final months of Henry's reign were marked by increasing desperation and profound loneliness. Without his inner circle of trusted companions, without access to the transformative rituals that had provided psychological refuge, and facing the prospect of civil war that could destroy his kingdom, Henry became a shadow of his former self. He was no longer the confident young commander who had won brilliant victories at Jarnac and Moncontour. nor the cultured king who had made the Louvre a center of European refinement. He was simply a man clinging to power while everything he had built crumbled around him. The end came with shocking suddenness on August 1st, 1589. A young Dominican friar named Jacques Clément arrived at the royal encampment at Saint-Cloud, claiming to carry urgent intelligence for the king. Henry, exhausted by months of siege and perhaps desperately hoping for news of potential support, agreed to meet with the monk privately. As they spoke together in the royal quarters, Clément suddenly produced a concealed dagger and drove it deep into the king's abdomen before being immediately killed by the royal guards. The wound was mortal, and Henry knew it. As he lay dying through the long night, he summoned Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince who would inherit the crown of France. Despite their religious differences, Navarre had remained loyal to the monarchy during the League's rebellion, and Henry recognized him as the only leader capable of reuniting the fractured kingdom. With his final breaths, the dying king spoke words that revealed both his political wisdom and his spiritual torment. "My brother, you see how I die, for having delayed too long in recognizing the true servants of God." At dawn on August 2nd, 1589, King Henry III died at the age of 37, taking with him secrets that would remain buried for centuries. The last of the Valois kings expired not in the magnificent chambers of the Louvre, surrounded by silk and luxury, but in a military tent, far from everything that had brought meaning to his extraordinary life. With his death, an entire world of hidden truths vanished into the darkness of history, leaving only fragments and whispers for future generations to decipher. The story of Henry III stands as one of history's most tragic examples of the collision between authentic identity and political necessity. Here was a monarch who possessed every advantage that 16th century Europe could offer: royal blood, military genius, artistic vision, and the love of a devoted wife. Yet he was ultimately destroyed not by foreign enemies or military defeat, but by his refusal to conform to the rigid expectations of masculine authority that defined his era. Modern historians continue to uncover new evidence of Henry's extraordinary double life, each discovery adding depth to our understanding of a ruler who dared to live as both king and queen in an age when such authenticity could prove fatal. His secret feminine identity wasn't weakness or perversion, as his enemies claimed, but perhaps the source of the very qualities that made him exceptional. His intuitive understanding of human nature, his appreciation for beauty and refinement, his ability to see beyond conventional thinking in both war and peace. The assassination of Henry III marked more than the end of a dynasty. It represented the triumph of fear over understanding, conformity over authenticity, hatred over love. In killing their king for the crime of being different, his enemies destroyed not just a man, but a vision of what royal authority might have become. The France that emerged from the religious wars would be more conventional, more predictable, and infinitely less extraordinary than the kingdom Henry had been creating in the hidden chambers of the Louvre. Today, as we continue to grapple with questions of identity, authenticity, and the courage required to live as one's true self, Henry's story resonates across the centuries. His life reminds us that the price of being different has always been high, but that some truths are worth preserving even at the cost of everything else. In those precious moments when he stood before his mirror, transformed into the woman he truly was, Henry achieved something that eluded him on every battlefield and in every council chamber. He became completely, authentically himself. And perhaps that brief, dangerous authenticity was worth more than all the crowns in Europe.